it's Lindsay. Welcome back to The Wandering Reader. Today I've got Stefan with me and he's going to be talking about his favourite books of 2018. So I believe he's got 6 to talk about today. So should we just get into it?
Yeah.
Okay, good, let's go.
So I'm going to talk about 6 books. I found it quite difficult to narrow down my books from last year because I read quite a few books and I gave quite a few of them 5 stars. The other difficulty I had was that I struggled to remember some of the stuff that I'd read at the beginning of the year. My memory isn't the best in the world, so I got to the end of the year and was asked by Lindsay what books would you like to talk about, and I couldn't really remember some of the ones that I'd read in January or February. So what I've done is I've grouped them into 2 different categories. So I've got some series that I enjoyed last year and I've got some individual books that I enjoyed last year. So none of these are in any particular order, and not all of them were written in 2018, but these were the highlights for me of 2018. The first one is the first series, which was by Scott Lynch, which the first one was called The Lies of Loch Lamora.
Can we hold it? Or?
Yeah, you can if you want to. Yeah.
Okay.
A series of books following our protagonist, a boy called Loch Lamora, who is an orphan and joins a sort of secret society, a secret group hiding behind religion and the church, is taught the ways of being a criminal, being a pickpocket and a mastermind of crimes against the rich in order to give more money to the church that he supposedly works for. Really enjoyable series. If you're someone who isn't sure about fantasy books and wants a dip your toe, as it were, into the world, this is a good start. It does have some choice language and some choice words, so you have to bear that in mind before you start. But he's a really charismatic character, and it's really nice to see him being dragged into the criminal underworld and starting to drown and being a little bit out of his depth, and yet he finds ways to escape the situations that he's in. And by the end of the book it leads nicely onto the rest of the series, where you feel it isn't stale but there's something new that you can read. So I've read 3 of these. There is another one that's due to be coming out which I'll read as soon as it does come out, but I'd recommend it wholeheartedly. Okay, so series number 2 is by Sebastian de Castell. I think this is one that you bought for me or recommended for me, which is part of the Greatcoats series of books, which follows our main character, a guy called Falkio, who is the first cantor of the Greatcoats. The Greatcoats being an organisation of men and women who the king has charged with carrying out his justice across the lands. So they ride out, they act as judges, if you like. They listen to local disputes and quarrels, and then they rule on whoever side they feel necessary it is to rule on, and therefore they're carrying out the king's word. Unfortunately, the king is quite idealistic and his kingdom has been decimated. He has been killed, and Falkio and the rest of his Greatcoats find themselves scorned and laughed at by the rest of society, and therefore they've been reduced to lower members of the world that they live in. And before their king fell, he did set each of them a particular challenge or a particular task that he wanted them to achieve, but he never told anyone of the tasks, and he made the individuals promise that they wouldn't say what task they were on themselves. So this is a story about the tasks that they have to set out. Falkio and 2 of his closest friends are all on their separate tasks but together. It's very witty, very funny in places. Again, if you're interested in fantasy, this is a good way in. The only confusing part of this can be that the world is inhabited by saints. So a lot of the characters refer to different saints, which you think at the beginning is just expressions, but in actual fact there are embodiments of these saints who live in the world. And so sometimes you can feel as if you're not quite sure who that person is or what they represent, but it does become clear as the series goes on. It's got an awful lot of emotional depth to this series. The characters are very interesting to follow in the sense that they're all flawed in some way, and it takes them a long while to realise what their own personal flaws are. So it does experiment and it does examine the human condition and the way in which we socialise and interact with other people and how that reflects on us as a person. But it's really, really enjoyable. Falkio's a really, really interesting character, and the three of them together have wonderful moments of comedy, of humour, but also of real emotional depth as well. Okay, the last series is the Mick Herron series. This one is called London Rules. However, this is the sort of latest book. It starts with a book called Slow Horses. I'm pretty sure this is book number 4. The reason I don't have all of them is because I was recommended to read these by a colleague at work who had the first 3 books, I think, and lent them all to me, and by the time I'd read the first 3 I decided that I wanted to buy this series, and Lindsay bought me the 4th one, and I'm going to plan on buying all of the previous ones. The story starts, it's set in a place called Slough House, which is a fictional place in London that is owned and run by MI5, and Slough House is full of MI5 agents who have somehow or in some way messed up. MI5 don't want to sack them, so what they do is they consign them to this place called Slough House, where they give them mundane tasks to do in order to convince them that quitting is the right thing, because there's no chance of them going back to MI5 and becoming proper agents. So the beginning of the book establishes our first character, River Cartwright, and what he did wrong and why he's consigned to Slough House. You think at the beginning it's going to be about this River character and about who he is and his sort of journey into try and get him back to MI5, which is not the case. It very quickly becomes apparent that the series for me is about the man who's in charge of Slough House, which is a man called Jackson Lamb, and he's possibly one of the greatest contemporary characters that I've read in terms of his presentation. He's a repulsive human being in terms of his personal habits, and yet he is extraordinarily sharp, and there are moments of pure wit from this character that have me laughing all the way through the book. I'm not a big person to read spy stories. I've read a bit of John le Carre, I've done a little bit of the Bourne series, I've read the first few of James Bond, but this really does get me interested in reading more about spy and crime stories, predominantly because of the characterisation of Jackson Lamb, which I don't think will happen in other stories or other series, but it'd be certainly something that I'd be interested in continuing. The other thing as well is Mick Herron's writing is just phenomenal. It's poetic at times. He starts each of the book off by choosing something fairly ordinary, a gust of wind, a spider, a fleck of dust, and he takes us from the bottom floor of Slough House all the way up to the top floor, and we explore what the inhabitants are doing at the start of the day, and we get this idea that every day is roughly the same, and all of these broken and characters who have little hope in getting back to where they once were, what it's actually like for them, and the boredom and the suffering that they are put through. Inevitably the series is about how their lives aren't quite as ordinary as MI5 would like, and while Jackson Lamb as the leader might not treat them with the same respect that they might get elsewhere, he certainly will defend them to the end, and each book is full of so many different twists and turns and surprises that it's very, very readable, because it's not easy to guess what's coming next. These I read in the space of sort of 6 weeks, all 4. They're really, really, really engaging, and I'd really recommend anyone to read them because they're fantastic. Okay, now I've got 3 more books to talk about, which was my sort of standalone ones. Again, these are in no particular order, but these were ones when I look back at my 2018 reading that I thought I'd want to talk about the most. The first one, which came from the beginning of the year, is Strange the Dreamer by, is it Laini Taylor? Which I'd read her previous trilogy.
Daughter of Smoke and Bone.
Yeah, I'd read all 3 of those, and they were okay, but I didn't sort of jump up and down about them. By the time I'd finished the first one, I thought, right, I'm invested, so I'll read the whole trilogy, because we had the whole trilogy in the house, but it wouldn't be something that I would massively recommend. This, on the other hand, was exceptional, and is I would argue is quite a bit different to the other trilogy as well, so I wouldn't necessarily judge her based on that one trilogy and never go back to her. This follows Laszlo Strange, a young librarian, an orphan, who has this dream or this ambition about this lost city called Weep. He has an obsession and a fascination about it, and gets the opportunity to go there when the inhabitants of the city turn up to his city and say, we need some help with something. It's a journey about a unsuspecting hero, a young boy who thinks that he is not worth anything when actually he holds the key to potentially everything. And what's nice about this story as well is we have a split narrative, and we have another storyline taking place in another location where by the end the two marry together, and we start to see the relevance of both stories to one another. It's got quite an emotional ending as well, an ending that is revealed right at the beginning, but you don't realise its significance until you get towards the end, and it does sort of hit you hard when you start reading that chapter and the things that happen. I think there's more in the series, isn't there? She certainly leaves it on a bit of a...
Muse of Nightmares came out at the end of last year.
Okay. She certainly leaves it on a bit of a cliffhanger, as it were, or a bit of a moment where the story could go in two different directions, so I would be interested in carrying it on, but yeah, really good, really interesting. My next, or my penultimate one, is a non-fiction book actually, and I think I managed to read quite a few non-fiction books last year. So I read Travelling to Infinity, which was the story of Jane Hawkins, Stephen Hawkins' wife. We listened together to an audiobook, didn't we, about a crime case.
I can't remember the name of that now.
No, False Report.
False Report, yeah.
And after we'd read that, or after we'd listened to that, I was quite interested in going back to another non-fiction story around the same sort of topic. So this one's I'll Be Gone in the Dark, which is by Michelle McNamara, which is her story of searching for or trying to piece together all of the evidence for the Golden State Killer, someone who was working during the 70s and the 80s in California and whose crimes are quite notorious. A quick search online, if you don't know, will tell you everything you need to know about the sort of person that this individual was and the sort of terror that they reigned in California. Michelle McNamara, investigative journalist, decides to take up the story and investigate it for herself, go back over old evidence, visit the old locations and try and piece together what she thinks happened, or certainly bring together evidence from different cases in order to make the evidence stronger moving forward. She tragically died whilst writing this story, and therefore it was finished by others for her. And after the story was written, some might say coincidentally, others might say otherwise, someone was arrested as the Golden State Killer, but she never got to see that or see the fruits of her labour. If you're interested in true crime, it's obviously going to be really appealing to you, but if you're not, it's definitely a nice way into it. This sense that Michelle McNamara herself isn't an expert in what to do or what to look for, and yet her obsession is a little bit like the obsession of the killer himself, and she does draw parallels throughout the book between those two things as well. So it is really interesting to read, and it is really gripping as well. Okay, and then my last book is what I would now consider to be my personal favourite book of all time. I've read this twice, and I think I've made a half a commitment to potentially go back to this book every single year and read it and see if there's something different I can take from it. And it's by Carlos Ruiz Zafón, and it's The Shadow of the Wind. I read it in my teens, I think in my late teens, and I decided to go back to it this year. And if you haven't read it, I think you're missing out on a modern classic. I think it's an absolutely exceptional book. So it's set in the backdrop of the Spanish Civil War in Barcelona, just after the conclusion of the Spanish Civil War, and Barcelona is presented as a city that is mourning. It's like an animal licking its wounds. It's very dark and brooding, and he uses pathetic fallacy a lot in the story to bring that to light. It follows a young person called Daniel, whose father owns and runs a bookshop, and takes Daniel to the Cemetery of Forgotten Books. And the gatekeeper of the cemetery says to Daniel, you can choose any book in here that you like. And he feels drawn to a particular book called The Shadow of the Wind. So the story in part is about the story, The Shadow of the Wind, the author, the background, and the mystery that surrounds this particular person, because someone seems to be destroying all of this man's works. And Daniel has this fierce determination to protect the Shadow of the Wind, but also discover what it is that's making someone go to such lengths to destroy every single work that's been produced by this author. But for me, the most impressive thing about this story is that it's a story about growing up. It's about a young boy growing up into a man, and that challenging time in his life where he's discovering girls, he's trying to work out what his goals are, trying to work out what his objectives are in life, whether he wants to follow on with his father's business or whether he wants to go in a different direction. It's about his friends, and it's a really, really lovely story of that translation between boy and man, and that journey that he goes through that I absolutely love. He's a master writer, a master storyteller. There's plenty of his other stories. If you haven't read Marina's one that stands out in my mind in particular, The Watcher in the Shadows as well. So anything that he's done I've read because it's exceptional, but this particular one, as a man, is something that's particularly appealing to me for that journey, but I think that it transcends gender and age and taste and everything like that, and it's just a real classic of a book. So yeah, if you haven't read it, you've got to grab a copy. So
there we go, guys. They were all of the books that Stefan wanted to talk about today. He has some really cool ones on the list. I've read one of them out of the whole of those. We don't have very similar taste, but you have kind of made me want to reread The Shadow of the Wind now, and I do need to read I'll Be Gone in the Dark, because yeah, just loads of people have been talking good things about that. So yeah. We'd love to have a chat with you in the comments below. Have you read any of these? Have you got any questions on anything that Stefan talked about today? Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you in our next video. Bye.